We are about to begin. Thank you so much, Barb McQuade, for joining us. Usually you are based in Michigan, but right now you're about 10 blocks away from me because you just came back from the Southern District of New York where you were catching the Sean Combs trial. But before we go into that, I would like to talk to you about your book, Attack from Within, and that it's just coming out in soft cover. And there's a lot to discuss about disinformation these days. What do you think about your book coming out in softcover form at this moment? What are the unique challenges we face right now on the topic of disinformation?
Well, one of my goals of the book is to help people to identify the tactics of disinformation so that we can see through them and be less likely to be manipulated by them. But they are everywhere we look in the current administration. The attacks on law firms for accusing them of having people in their law firms, lawyers who work with them, or clients they've represented who have been involved in the weaponization or lawfare of the Justice Department. Complete fabrication. And yet we see law firms agreeing to pay pro bono in terms of pro bono legal hours just to make it go away and to make it stop. So it's an incredible use of power through disinformation. The same thing we're seeing applied to universities like Harvard. The idea that the reason that the Trump administration is taking away their funding or blocking their foreign students is because of anti-Semitism. Certainly there's anti-Semitism everywhere. Harvard's campus is no exception, and I know they're working to remedy that. But that is not a problem unique to Harvard, and I don't think that's the reason that the Trump administration is going after them. I think it is instead part of the culture war. So all of this is framed in terms of disinformation, which is, a germ of truth, but amplified to create an emotional agenda, to cause people to act more on feeling than on fact, and to advance some political division in society. It's working incredibly well, I think, all around us in this administration. So as I said, I hope my book can focus on solutions in an effort to help us recognize what's factual and what's not.
Right. And on the subject of Harvard put out a legal brief last night. We wrote it up on the website. I want to read a passage of it because you mentioned the justification about using anti-Semitism as an excuse for these massive funding freezes. And Harvard asked a pretty to the point question about it. They wrote, the government's across the board freeze and terminations are unreasonable and unreasoned. The government asserts anti Semitism concerns as a basis of its actions, but fails to explain how the termination of funding for research to treat cancer, support veterans, and improve national security addresses anti Semitism. So, you work in academia as well, among one of the many things that you do. What do you, when you see these dramatic cuts to education, they claim that it's to address some social ill or another, but it has no connection to it. How does that chill universities more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's also, Adam, no coincidence that Harvard is the university that the Trump administration has chosen to take on. Harvard has the reputation of being one of the best universities in the country, one of the oldest, and one of the wealthiest. So I think is an effort to take on the so-called elites, framing universities as institutions of leftists and globalists and not acting in the best interests of America, in an effort to get Harvard to bend to its will. I mean, they are no doubt putting some serious hurt on Harvard, taking away billions of dollars in funding. And it isn't like, I know Harvard is well endowed, it has a big endowment. Most of those funds are earmarked for very specific things. Somebody gives the Adam Glassfeld professorship in political science. You can't take that money and then move it over to medical research. And so it's really hurting them. They typically hire all kinds of research students and scholars, and they use grant funds to conduct that research. That is all being halted. And so that is some serious hurt. And so applying pressure, I think the ultimate goal is to get Harvard to bend its knee, to fall to its knees and say, enough, we'll do whatever you say, we'll do whatever you make us do. And if the Trump administration can get Harvard to do that, then I think every other university realizes that they too are in the crosshairs. They probably already do, but it seems to me that's what's really going on here. And legally, I think Harvard's in very good standing. They've obtained temporary restraining orders from courts. I think ultimately they are likely to prevail legally, but I don't know that this is really a legal fight. I think it's a political fight. And many universities are going to calculate that they just don't have the resources to mount this kind of fight. And so, even if and when Harvard wins in the courts, it will be costly, it will take time. And, Donald Trump is the master at winning by losing. He'll say, well, that just shows that the courts are stacked with leftist, liberal, radical, Marxist, whatever he wants to call them. Um, but at the same time, I think we're going to see lots of people calculate that it just isn't worth the cost to fight back.
Right. And this comes in the context of a broader attack on education. There was another ruling against the Trump administration over the dismantling of the Department of Education. What do you think these attacks on education writ large, how does that impact the fight against disinformation when the core of a democracy is an informed citizenry?
Well, you're absolutely right. If you read all of those Federalist papers written by Madison and Hamilton and all of those founding fathers, they talk so much about the importance of information and an informed electorate, and that a democracy is completely based on that. And with information, voters can make good choices. So the converse is, without accurate information, they cannot make good choices. And in fact, what we see, I think, is more tribal warfare than the sharing of information or persuasion. People want to vote against their enemy, not in favor of some policy that they think makes sense. And so that divide and conquer strategy, I think, is fed with disinformation. Right now we are seeing an attack on immigrants and immigration. If we really wanted to solve the problem of immigration, I think we could do that, right? We could have some common sense legislation that talked about deportations, a path to citizenship, ways to secure the border. There are all kinds of good ideas out there that we could implement. But instead, we know last term during the presidential election, Donald Trump pushed hard to kill the bill because he'd rather use it as a campaign tactic to be able to use it to divide people. So, to talk about immigrants as animals, other than human, to suggest that certain people are not entitled to due process. They don't talk about the process of all of that. They talk about how bad individuals are. Find, the killer of Laken Riley. You can always find a poster child for bad behavior. But what does it say about the masses of other people who are being treated inhumanely and are being denied constitutional rights? So this idea of disinformation is really about distracting us from policy matters and getting us to feel in an emotional way that it's us versus them, and that we must do whatever it is to defeat our enemies, and all that really matters is winning.
Mhm. And there's another topic related to disinformation, and I want to pick your brain about. And it's an extraordinary case out of the Southern District of New York. It's a case of Yunseo Chung. She's one of the Columbia students who's targeted for deportation, and it goes to disinformation and images, because a lot of what we've seen in these deportation cases of student protesters are these arrests with a number of immigration officials swarming the student, usually masked, and hauling them off. Now, in the case of Yunseo Chung, there is no such video because she's not in custody. And the reason that she's not in custody is that ICE hasn't found her. So the case is at an impasse where the government has the option to serve her attorneys and initiate her deportation process, but the government hasn't decided that they want to do that because they might want to arrest her and have one of those other viral moments. Can you comment on how the Trump administration uses imagery to elicit something from the general public and how that ties in to disinformation.
Well, you're absolutely right, Adam. I mean, as you said, they could simply serve her attorneys and begin the process and get her out of the country if that's all they really wanted to do. But instead, I think these videos create fear. Nobody wants to be surrounded by masked men and whisked off in a car and taken to some prison somewhere. We've also seen those images out of the Salvadoran prison when those men were brought there and their heads shaved, on the plane with being forced to kneel and in their underwear. It is imagery that I think is degrading and dehumanizing to suggest that there are some people who are other than human or less than human, and degrading. But we also see it, Adam, this imagery, I think, in Donald Trump wielding power. Think about how often there have been these signing ceremonies where he's sitting in the Oval Office and there are aides walking up to him with these folders and he's signing his name while he remains seated and others stand around him. Like he is at some sort of throne of power. Or, I think of Don Corleone in the Godfather. He sits there and everyone stands around him while he pets his cat. These are displays of power, I think, that are designed to elicit fear and intimidation and coercion, to create the impression that you just can't win, so you might as well give up.
Right. One of the most extraordinary things that I thought happened during the beginning of Emil Bovie's tenure as a senior Trump administration official, I think the Wall Street Journal reported that his first directive to immigration officials was make sure that you take video and post it on social media. It's a remarkable thing for a senior DOJ official to have become the marching orders. Was that you were inside the DOJ, you were a US attorney. Have you ever heard of anything like that from such a senior DOJ official?
No, Adam, and in fact, as you described that, I literally feel sick to my stomach. I mean, truly, I'm not misusing the word literally. Like it makes my stomach drop to hear that, because there are DOJ regulations about press policies, and many of them forbid this kind of behavior. The idea of the perp walk is something that is forbidden by the Justice Department, because nothing in the press policy is supposed to in any way affect the person's right to a fair trial or the fair administration of their case. And when you do a perp walk or video of their arrest, it does create this impression of guilt. The purpose of the press in DOJ is to inform the public so that the Justice Department remains accountable to the public about how it is using tax dollars. It is also sometimes important to assure the public that investigations are occurring when there's been an emergency. If there's been a terrorist attack, to give people information, let them know what's happening from time to time. Maybe there's even a be on the lookout for when there's somebody who's conducted an attack and you share their photo. But it is never supposed to be used to in any way affect public opinion about the person's guilt or innocence. And it seems to me this idea of be sure to take video of the arrest does exactly that, an absolute violation. Since the 1970s, Adam, it has been such an important part of the Justice Department to operate under what's called the principles of federal prosecution. These were created after Watergate in an effort to make sure everybody was on the same page about nonpartisanship in the Department of Justice. Everything you do must be tethered to facts or law, and even anything that might give an impression that you are engaging in politically motivated activity is forbidden. And, to grow up in that atmosphere and to see somebody abusing the power so much in this way is really sickening and disgusting.
Hmm. And now, as you probably know, Emil Bovie has been nominated by Trump to serve as a federal judge. What should lawmakers ask him about, given the reporting that he's trying to have these photo shoots that are compromising people's rights? We've seen all this reporting about his trying to gin up certain investigations against green banks and others. What should lawmakers ask him about when he comes for confirmation?
Well, I would most certainly want to ask him a lot of questions related to his activity around the dismissal of the prosecution of the New York mayor. We saw early on there was a pending indictment against the mayor, and according to memos, Email Bove directed the U.S. attorney there to drop the case. So much of that, in my view, was contrary to the rule of law. We saw resignations over that. And Email Bove wrote a memo about that, describing what he thought happened and then contradicted himself. So I think that should be very fertile ground for questions. I think what they want to get to is whether this is a person of integrity, whether this is a person who can be trusted with the awesome power of a federal judge, a power that can literally be a difference in life and death in deciding whether cases ought to proceed, whether cases that are subject to the death penalty may proceed, whether people go to prison or whether they get to maintain their liberty. And so I think he's got already in just the 4 months he was acting in a leadership role at the Department of Justice, a lot of ground to explain. He too was involved in some of the dismissals of some of the agents and prosecutors involved in the January 6th prosecutions. What was that all about? Is it about political partisanship? Where does he stand on the 2020 election? Does he believe the election was stolen? What plans does he have to effectuate any accountability and any revenge about that? So I think there are a lot of areas for questioning. And, although I think it does feel like we're in a moment when Republicans have the votes in the Senate for confirmation, we did see the Republican Senate reject Ed Martin for the position of U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C. And that gives me hope that maybe with some of the right questions, this nomination too could see the same fate.
Of course. And of course, that Emil Bovee used to be Trump's criminal defense attorney in multiple cases, saw him all the time during Trump's criminal trial. You mentioned the case against Eric Adams and dropping it. One of the very interesting things about Emil Bovee's presence in that case, he argued a hearing alone at the prosecution table, which kind of signals how little the Southern District was on board with what he was doing. Want to pivot a bit from Eric Adams to a different mayor, Ross Baraka. This is breaking news. He filed a lawsuit against Alina Habba for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and state law defamation. And this kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, the perp walks. There were some remarks that Alina Habba made during the charging of Ross Baraka in the case that was just dismissed, that folks said kind of crossed the line with legal ethics. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, really interesting case. And of course, the related case with the Congresswoman McIver, who has been charged with assaulting or impeding federal officers, kind of related to that same incident where we had the mayor and members of Congress visiting an ICE facility in New Jersey. And ultimately, there's kind of a scrum and the mayor gets arrested and we see charges against him dropped, but then charges filed against the member of Congress. It's an interesting case. This strikes me as one of those cases where maybe there is probable cause to suggest they are impeding the work of ICE. Not clear to me from the complaint that was filed with Congresswoman McIver. You see some screenshots where there's physical contact, where people are, bodies are kind of pushing up against each other, but we have not seen the full video of it. And the only people with access to the full video are the people from ICE. And so it seems to me that if it were worse than what we've seen, we would have seen that. Instead, all we see is, bodies kind of up against each other. And so I don't know, where that will ultimately fall. But the fact that we haven't seen that suggests to me that we've probably seen the best that's out there. That seems to be bodies up against each other with perhaps ICE acting aggressively to protect their turf. Unclear. Certainly, a mayor, a member of Congress, does not have any right to interfere with the work of a federal agent, even if they don't like that work, if it's engaging in, immigration activity. You can't stand in their way. You can't try to impede that work. But what's interesting is they continued the prosecution against the member of Congress. They dropped the prosecution against the mayor. It makes me wonder whether there was any merit to it whatsoever in the first place. And of course, Alina Habba made some disparaging comments about the mayor and about this case. And so I think it's good to me to see the mayor fighting back because what we're seeing with Alina Habba, I think, is a lot of swagger and bravado. Again, when I served as U.S. attorney, my gosh, the most you ever said were what was in the four corners of the indictment. You might explain why it was important to protect the work of any federal agency and state that anybody who violates the law will be held accountable. But instead, we heard a lot more. In fact, Alina Habba herself actually participated in an arrest earlier in her term, on the streets. So it feels more like cosplay prosecutor, cosplay federal agent than it does the sort of uh, understated, clear-eyed, reserved judgment that you would hope to see from a U.S. attorney.
Right. The real thing, the real kind of federal prosecution is much less showy and much less full of verdict before a trial. Want to go back to one of the things that you said about the case against Congresswoman McIver and the video. Isn't that the core of disinformation? Using an image or potentially manipulating an image to instill fear or to create a misleading public image.
Yes. Now, again, I don't know the facts. I don't know what else the video might show because I haven't seen the whole video. But to cherry pick a couple of screenshots to show only the video in progress, we don't see how it began, we don't see how it ends. We just sort of see this sort of scrum of humanity kind of all pushing up against each other and saying, aha, there she is, assaulting an officer. See, they're touching right there. We don't know. So if it is, as you described, just cherry picked and there is nothing more than that, then to suggest that she assaulted an agent strikes me as disinformation because assault brings with it an intentional act, an intentional touching, or putting someone in fear for their physical safety. And if instead she was pushed, I don't see how that amounts to an assault. She's also charged with obstructing and impeding, and so that doesn't necessarily require physical touching. But I agree that I think it is at least suspect to me that this could be cherry picked photos and video because we have not seen the entire thing. And it seems to me that the entity in possession of the entire thing is the government. And so if it were worse than what we've seen, I think we would have seen that by now.
And certainly we'll be seeing it soon if it doesn't go the way of Ross Baraka's case and the case isn't dropped entirely by Alina Habba. I want to pivot to something, a question that I ask in all interviews because the All Rise News mission statement, the editorial mission, focuses on civic engagement. So what do you think the folks who are watching, you have hundreds of people watching right now, say that they want to combat disinformation, they want to do something to affect this issue? What do you recommend viewers do?
I think the best thing all of us can do is to talk to our friends and neighbors and family members. Now, maybe we live in a bubble and everybody in our world, gets accurate information and is well informed. But certainly there's a role for correcting information you see on social media that's incorrect. But I think, finding people, whether it's, your crazy uncle or your neighbor or a friend, people who may have believed some of the things that's out there. I think that people are most influenced by people they know. And so I encourage people to talk with their friends and neighbors and loved ones who may believe some of this disinformation, who may believe that the 2020 election was stolen and January 6th was somehow a day of love and that the pardons were somehow justified or, any number of things that we're hearing right now. And I think the way to approach people is with respect, with curiosity, um, because if all you do is, you know, browbeat them and tell them, how foolish they are, that's not a way to persuade people. People are not going to come around to your way of thinking because they have pride on the line. But I think instead, if you can approach people by asking questions, what's your source on that? Where did you hear that? What do you think was that person's motive in saying that? What was the evidence that they had to support that claim? Um, or maybe were you aware of this counterclaim? You may not convince them in the first conversation that they're 100% wrong about everything and you're 100% right.
Mm,
But you might be able to plant some seeds and cause, and they may never even admit to you that they have changed their mind. But if you can plant some seeds, maybe they go out and start rethinking the conclusion that they so dogmatically had believed before. So I think all of us can be ambassadors for the truth. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's difficult, but I think it's worthwhile.
mm. And one last question, because I'd be remiss not to mention the reason that you are in New York City right now, or this might have been just one of your stops. We just left federal court. You were watching the case of Sean Combs, and we've been talking about videos. This one is an authenticated video that this testimony related to. Tell us what you saw.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell you, this is not the reason I'm here. I'm actually here to launch the paperback of my book, as you mentioned, kindly mentioned earlier, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, out today in paperback. And so I'm doing some events around that. But I had some time, and I thought, gosh, what would I like to see? I'd like to see what's going on in federal court in this high-profile trial. So I did see the testimony of security guard Eddie Garcia, who testified that he was working security at that hotel in Los Angeles in 2016 and he authenticated the video. We see Cassie Ventura come to press the elevator button, and then we see Sean Combs come grab her, throw her to the ground, and kick her. He also testified that he was asked to sign a non-disclosure document agreement with Sean Combs, and that he did that. So, I was in the overflow room, so there were some gasps in the room about as we saw the video. I think it's one that's been in the media before, but this was the day that the jury and members of the public saw it, and I think it's an important witness in the case and telling that story.
Mm. Thank you so much, Barb, and congratulations on the launch of your new soft cover, the Attack from Within. I encourage everyone to read it.
Got
Uh,
it right here.
oh, fantastic. And
Excellent.
welcome to New York.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's great to be here. I love New York. I'm having a wonderful time.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. And I will actually be in Southern District of New York myself not too long from now. Congrats again, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me on. And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you. Bye bye.